can you tell us a little bit about the Pontic region and its history, and just give us a little framework and introduction to the topic?
The word Pontic comes from Pontos Evxinos, as the Greek call the Black Sea, the hospitable sea in Greek. The coasts of the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea were inhabited by Greeks since ancient times, until about 100 years ago, when the Ottoman Empire came to an end and the Republic of Turkey was established. According to the last census of 1914 of the Ottoman Empire, about 2 million Greeks lived in these areas, which are now part of Turkey. In the northern coast, which is called Pontus region, their number was given as 700,000. The Greeks of the Black Sea call themselves Pondians, Pondos Greeks.
And you wrote a book about this topic in this field, and it's called Die letzten Byzantiner. And maybe you can tell us what it's about and what was your motivation, or why did you come up with the idea to write a book like this?
Yeah, unfortunately, this book exists only in German. It's in English, The Last Byzantines, The Expulsion of the Greeks from the Black Sea, A Search for Traces. And it was released in 2019, and it's based on my trip to northern Turkey 3 years before. I myself, it's important to know, grew up in West Germany. My mother is Greek, my father is German, and my maternal grandparents were among the 1.2 million Greeks who had to leave their home country in the Ottoman Empire and were resettled in Greece after the First World War. My grandmother came from Ordu, a harbor town near Trabzon. It's famous for its hazelnuts. And I had long intended to travel to the Black Sea, which I had always associated with my grandmother. I wanted to see the place where she grew up and in a way where I am coming from. So I wanted to know more, to know what had happened during the war and why my grandmother had to leave this place. So, and I knew in this period there lied the origins of the enmity between Greece and Turkey, which is still lasting.
It's interesting you mentioned Ordu as the capital of, or like the center of hazelnuts, because my father, who's from Giresun, owns this necklace who has a hazelnut inside. So it's quite nice you mentioned this as a note. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about your family story, and also explain maybe in which, how you can compare it, or like how you can sort of structure it in the overall discourse of the Pontus region. Like, does your family's history sort of fit into the general knowledge of the Pontus region? As
not exactly. When I started my research, I didn't know much about the Pontus question, as it's called now here. I was just aware of the fact that my grandparents were expelled from Turkey, from their homeland, and were resettled in northern Greece after the First World War. And so I went on this journey to northern Turkey, and to just in the footsteps of the Greeks. So I wanted to know whether there's still something existing of the Greek culture there in the region. And then I came to the point that I went to Ordu, and I didn't know one. I didn't know no one there. I met a man who whose ancestors had the same history like mine, only in reverse. His grandmother was expelled from northern Greece to Turkey, because it was not only that all the Greeks which lived in the Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey, were expelled from Turkey to Greece, but in the opposite, on the other hand, 400,000 Muslims from northern Greece had to leave their homeland and were expelled to Turkey as well. And he had the same history than like my family. So we wandered together to Ordu, the old town of Ordu, and saw the empty houses which belonged to the Greek and the Armenian population 100 years ago. And that was a strong feeling for me to see where my grandmother was raised, and to see the church, which is still existing there. And that was the point that I wanted to know what exactly happened, why the Greeks were expelled from these regions, and what happened in this time. And of course, I knew about the genocide of the Armenian people in 1915 and later. But I was not aware of the history of the Greeks, and it was a quite similar history that I uncovered then. So
maybe you can elaborate or like tell us a bit more about the traces that you found in Ordu, like of Pontic communities.
On my wanderings to the old town of Ordu, I found everything as it used to be. Many houses were Greeks and Armenian. Had one lived, now had people living in them again, but many houses were empty as well. And the Armenian church, for example, was torn down, but the Greek church, where my grandmother Alexandra was baptized, is still there and intact and now used as a cultural center. And then I found out that my grandmother Alexandra forced deportation because she was evacuated in 1916 by Russian warships. And because in this time, the Ottoman army was clearing the Greek neighborhoods on the Black Sea. Almost all Greeks of Ordu were driven on a 200-kilometer march to the hinterland, where they were crowded into camps. Official justification was the same like with the Armenians 1 year before. The Ottoman army feared that the Greeks would make common cause with the Russians, which was partly true because partisans were hidden in the mountains and supplied with the Russian weapons. And not only in Ordu, but in all coastal towns, Greeks were driven in this time into the hinterland, along the Black Sea, but also along the Aegean Sea, where many Greeks lived. And many died on these marches, were massacred by regular troops and bandits. Their villages were torn down, set on fire. Many inhabitants lost their life. And the Pontus Greeks speak now of a genocide against their people, because 350 people, half of the population, were killed, were said to have died in these times by death marches or massacred. And I myself saw suddenly part of a story where some of the worst ethnic cleansings of the last century were happening.
And this is also something that you write about in your book, and so yet your book contributes to this knowledge.
Yeah, my book is, on the one hand, the first level is my book, The Journey along the coast of the Black Sea, from Trabzon to Istanbul and what I experienced there. But the second level is my family history. I wanted to find out what happened 100 years ago, why my family was expelled from there. And the third level is the search for the big historical connections and the answer to the question why the enmity between Turks and Greeks started, and what was the reason for that.
Thank you. And for example, nowadays, when we think of Pontic communities living in Greece or anywhere else, what do they remember and how do they remember themselves?
The commemoration started not in the first generations, but in the second, third, or even fourth generation. Because the first generation, the generation of my grandmother, they didn't look back. They just looked straight on, and they wanted to get Greeks somehow. They wanted to forget what happened to their people. They wanted to forget that they are refugees. They wanted to start a new life. And so, now the old traditions are discovered new by young people, which is quite interesting. So we remember the Pontic history in stories which are told in music and traditions. So I can tell an example for that. When I met the descendants of the Pontus Greeks near Trabzon on my journey, to whom I could speak Greek, which was very interesting, they knew a song I knew from my grandmother, and from my mother, literally. And my mother used to sing it, and it's in the Pontic Greek dialect, and it's called Ekain Keto Tsambasin. Tsambasin was burned down, and it plays in Ordu, the town of my grandmother. Because Tsambasin is an Alp, a high plateau in the hinterland of Ordu, where all the rich people from Ordu spend the summer times in their houses. So, and yeah, that's a story of a real catastrophe which was happened in Chambasi in the Alp. And later on, now it is a symbol for the expulsion of the Greeks from their homeland. And it's quite similar. The Germans have a similar thing with the song Mai Käfer flieg, which is a lullaby today. But yeah, it reminds the people from their, when there were refugees from Prussia, because in the song there's, Prussia is mentioned. Prussia was burned down, so, and it's quite similar song. It's interesting. So, and yeah, that's on the one hand the songs, and on the other hand the dances. For example, the Horon dance of the Pontus region is still danced here with the Pontic Greeks. So even the people which are now living in Germany find them together and to celebrate their traditions. The young people. And you have the Kemense. The Kemense, yeah, which are called lira in Greek as well. So the instruments, yeah, the drum and the Kemense and the dances, so, and the musicians. And it's still in northern Greece. It's yeah, it's coming up again, this sort of tradition. So it's interesting you're mentioning this, because of course, like my family's history is more, as you said, like the other side or the other way around, and I find these informal family histories very important for the whole commemoration memory, because when you think of Kemenche and Horon, this is something that we still, even if my family is mostly now living in Germany, at weddings we still have always the Kemenche play, and we still have the Horon dance at every wedding. And my grandparents, who in Samsun in the countryside have lots of fields where they grow vegetables and fruit, we have a very famous fruit tree with yellow pears. And they are very special, they're very tasty, and you don't find them anywhere else. And this is something that we know as something that has been left to us by the Greek, because obviously this wasn't grown by my grandparents. This is a tree that always existed. And we always wonder what to do once this tree is dead, because we love the yellow pears, they're very famous in our family. And it's quite nice, because this is also how this history that in my family, explicitly no one is talking about, but everyone knows it exists, and you can see it through little practices like the Kemenche and the Horon, or the fruit tree in the garden. Mm. And so, speaking of these informal family histories, what do you think, how important these are for the general knowledge of history and memory? Oh, that's difficult to tell. In my opinion, is like when you're not rooted in this region, like your family maybe is, it's a little bit more difficult to get this sort of commemoration. So because you are uprooted somehow, so you're in a new region and you try to find yourself there. And yeah, I think it's important to have these stories and traditions, but you don't have something like a house or a tree or so. That's all what you have is virtual somehow. Or oral history. Oral history, for example. Mm. Yeah, and even if you live then in Germany, in a total strange country, so, and you have to find new sorts of narratives maybe to keep in touch with your history.
And do you think, because I think that the younger generations now start to be more aware of this history and they're more interested in this history, do you think it's easy to speak to the older generations about this? Do you consider them as being open about this history, or do you think it's hard to get the knowledge?
Yeah, it's still hard to get the knowledge. For the first generation is dead now, so we have no witnesses about this time. We have some stories written in books or told stories. So, and the second generation is maybe the generation who tried to adapt in the society, to really assimilate, maybe. So, and it's not really open. And the third generation is maybe the first generation who keeps in touch with this again. So that's what I see in my research or when I talk to people. So that the young generation is more interested, but there's nobody who they can ask now. So we depend on research, on books, on what is virtual oral history. Yeah.
And what about Pontic communities in Greece right now? Like, how do they commemorate? Are there festivals or certain holidays or certain celebrations to remember?
Yeah, when you travel to northern Greece, for example, it's at some places really like you would travel through the Pontic region, so 100 years ago. They have festivals where play the musicians with the kemençe and they're dancing the Horon dance, and they cook Pontic meals, and okay, they don't talk this Pontic dialect anymore. This is really, but it's it's a lot like maybe in former times. Yeah. And for example, on the University of Thessaloniki, there's a new class which teaches the Pontic dialect, and the young people are really interested in that. So the interest is there. You know.
And do you know any Pontic cuisine? Is it, for example, what's?
Yeah, of course. My Greek family is in Greece, so still they all live in Athens now. No one has left in northern Greece, which is also interesting. That the urbanization of the migration maybe it's taking place, but they're all not really interested in this story. Yeah? It's like they live. They're differently interested, I would say. So they're interested in what I was doing with this book, and they asked for that, but it's not really that they are searching for things or trying to find out. It's like they established a new life somehow, and it's quite common in Greece, I think.
Yeah. Because I was asking about the cuisine, because I wonder if it's still similar to what my family now is sort of cooking at the Black Sea region. Because you have the anchovies that are still cooked every winter, and one of the common ingredients is cornmeal, mice meal, and cabbage, Schwarzkohl. And these are like sort of the main ingredients for every meal, and it's always it's a very repetitive kind of cooking, and it's, you know, you use it in very various forms. So I was wondering if it's similar.
The Hamsi fish, from
Hamsi,
the Black Sea,
of course.
it's very famous, of course. Okay.
And is there also a memory or a commemoration of Pontic history or Pontic region that does not only focus on the violent past or on the bloody past, but also in a maybe more positive aspects of it?
Yeah, that's maybe what I mentioned with the dances and tradition and the music. Yeah, when my mother tells about what she heard from her mother, from my grandmother, it's always like she tells the stories how Greeks and Turks worked together and lived together side by side and helped each other. And she told a lot of stories about the Turkish the Turkish master at the place in Ordu, who was big friend to the Greeks there, and they had a good relationship there. And it was not like maybe the official history says in Greek, like we were 400 years under Turkish law and occupied. So it was more, they lived together somehow. It was not, the Ottoman state was not a Turkish state, it was a diverse state. Yeah? And the ethnic groups, they had autonomy widely with their things, and they could manage their things on their own. So it was not like a Turkish state, or we were under Turkish law. So, but the Ottoman Empire was a multicultural state, somehow a multicultural empire. Okay, it was not democratic, it was a totalitarian system. But in these memories, they, I think, they had like a good time together, and they see that there's not a big cultural difference between Turks and Greeks. So we have the same songs, we share the same stories, not sharing the same religion. That's the only difference.
Yeah, it's interesting because, for example, in our case, in my family's case, it's even though they know that people have been speaking the Pontic dialect 1 or 2 generations ago, they don't consider themselves as Pontics, which is also, of course, also one of the consequences of this forced assimilation.
Yeah, and that's a big question about what's the definition, what's identity, who you are. You have these ethnic groups there, the Laz people, for example. You have the people who define themselves as Greek. You have the people who define themselves as Turk. Who's a Turk? Yeah,
exactly.
Turkish people are also from many people, and that's very difficult. And that's interesting. You go there. When I came to the Pontic region and I met these people from the hinterland of Trabzon who spoke this Greek dialect, still there, because they were converted into Muslims in the Middle Age for a long time ago, and so they could stay there after this exchange of populations after the First World War. They are still living there and feel themselves, of course, as Turks. They are Turks, they speak Turkish, the children go to Turkish schools. On the other hand, they know they're Greek. And the third level is, if you ask them, what's your ethnic group? We are Laz as well. So, and that's the point where maybe you can desperate, and, or you start really to rethink about your own identity. And that was very interesting for me. And they invited me and they said, you're one of us because you're from here. Your grandmother is from this region. Okay, you're one of us, you're one of our family. And that was a great experience.
Yeah, it sounds like the whole idea of identity sort of was deconstructed, and then it actually doesn't exist, and all those borders and definitions become blurry, and suddenly
and they're so meaningless when
exactly.
you're there.
Very nice. And why do you think students or general people in Germany should be interested in this kind of history, and why is it relevant for an overview of the European history or world history?
Yeah, maybe one point is that in the German history classes, the Ottoman Empire is just a footnote. It's not much that we learned in school about what happened, for example, in the First World War, though Germany was at the side of the Ottoman Empire, was partner in the war. And that's a shame, I think, because Eastern Europe shares the same history like the Greeks, Bulgarians, Romanians, the whole Balkan states, with Turkey and as descendants of the Ottoman Empire. And it's important to know that, to understand European history. European history is not only Western European history, it's not only the history of Germany, France, England, Spain. and not only the history of what I call the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, but we have also the Eastern Roman Empire. You know? When Constantine moved the Roman capital to Constantinople, now Istanbul, the Roman Empire still existed. You know? And that's, for example, the reason that the Greeks in Turkish, they call Rum, still Rum. They're Romans for the Turks. And they feel themselves, and they are somehow the descendants of the Romans, yeah, and still where still the Roman spirit is living, yeah. So,
and of course, also thinking of Germany's history and thinking about the 20th century and the whole so-called Gastarbeiter history. Lots of people who came to Germany have this history with them as well, because lots of people came from Greece, and lots of people, many people came also from Turkey, and they came from the Pontic region, for example, or came from northern Greece. So this history and these traditions and these ideas of belonging, just like with you or with me, exist also within Germany, and they're also part of, you know, German history, therefore. And
it was a good experience for me to grow up in a West German town where Gastarbeiter, guest workers from Turkey, Greece, Spain, everywhere, Italy, were living together, because I knew the enmity between Greeks and Turks from my Greek relatives, yeah. But when I was in Germany, it was like the Turkish guy is quite common for me. As I know his culture, and we share the same interests, maybe. And when I went to Turkish restaurants, it was like I went to Greek restaurants, and I asked myself, because where's this enmity from? Yeah, because we share the same culture, we are quite similar, and we move and maybe behave quite similar, yeah. So, yeah. And that was an interesting new way to maybe communicate between cultures.
Also with Foron and all those folk dances, it's a community experience, because you don't dance on your own. You know, you have. I mean, in Samsun, they still dance a lot sirtaki, for example, when you go to weddings. And, you know, it's this whole like having your arms around and having your hands in hands. And so it's like a group dance, it's a group experience. It's like a whole community idea behind. And it's not just two people, it can end up with 20 people standing in a row next to each other.
Yeah, and every dance has its meaning. Yeah, it's different. But when you dance alone, it's a sort of desperate dance. It's a dance of like a sadness dance or so. And when you dance together, yeah, it's joy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's no battling or like no competing with each other. If you do it in a row and like as a group together, sort of it's like one entity sort of dancing together. And I like the remark on how the importance of dance. It's true.
I don't know all dance traditions in Eastern Turkey, but I know the Kurds, for example, dance similar. So they have in Berlin, they are a very strong community, and they're dancing, for example, at the 1st of May on Kreuzberg every year. And it's fantastic, because there are really hundreds of people dancing this.
I think actually this is also something that happens more frequently now, because I remember from my grandparents, they told once that there was maybe 20 years ago, a group of Greek people came to the village because they were looking for the cemetery, the Greek cemetery, or like the Christian cemetery, and they couldn't find it, and because probably it was destroyed.
It's all destroyed, yeah.
And it's quite interesting, but that like nearly 100 years later, this village was remembered of its own history. And people who were living there, even though they don't consider themselves as Greek, but as Turks, whatever their history is, they felt shame that those cemeteries didn't exist anymore, because they felt responsibility for them not being there anymore, because so no matter what happens, cemeteries should not be destroyed. You know, it's like the soul should be able to rest. And you know, I find it quite significant that now, so many years later, there is a certain feeling or like a certain understanding of shame and irresponsibility.
Do you think so? But
I mean, I just can see it. I can only speak of this community, this community in this village, that they felt embarrassed when people came and said, we used to have a cemetery here. And I mean, I speak of people who were probably, who were definitely not born in that time. They were born 50 years later or something. So.
Well, I know in Istanbul are many people who are aware of the Greek history of the city, but I think outside, or the majority of the Turkish people don't really care about the history or don't know about that, or do not interest. So when I met this guy in Ordu, he said, oh, I'm one of the 4 or 5 people in Ordu who are really interested in the history of the city. Everybody else doesn't interest in history.
I agree, definitely. But I think also one of the reasons is because of the very strong, like forced politics of assimilation that was forced on the people. Because, I mean, the whole idea of founding the Republic, which is very similar to the idea of the French Republic, you know, just you have one flag, one language, one national citizenship, one nationality, and everyone is the same under that one flag. And so I think this forced identity politics that began in the beginning of the 20th century really had its very strong effect to even nowadays, that people don't dare to question their own history because they don't want to dig in this. They just want to say, because it's easier to say I'm Turkish and this is it.
Maybe it's quite easier to do this inside of the European Union, for example, where you can discover the regions again, so because you have this safe frame. But in Turkey, for example, which is alone somehow, a nation state, so, and surrounded maybe by enemies, you don't know exactly, and you have to keep this this state stable. Yeah, that's a difficult thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very nice talk and for answering the questions. And I think students will really appreciate your insights, and also it's nice to see that so many generations after a historical event, people are still trying to remember and sort of manifestate oral history like you have done. And thank you very much for your time and everything you've said.
Thank you for your interest that you came here.